Welcome. This short video clip has been designed to discuss one of the weaknesses that students demonstrate when they sit P5. That is, that they approach the exam as if it were a P3 exam, focusing on issues that affect choice of business strategy. They forget that P5 focuses on performance management and performance measurement systems. What you'll hear next is a conversation between a student, Jo, and her tutor, Peter. Jo has failed P5 twice, and Peter has offered to review her answer to a practice exam question with her. Jo has submitted an answer to a question on Porter's 5 forces that is taken from the June 2013 exam. Peter has now marked Jo's script and has a number of comments. You may find it useful to have the exam question to hand as you listen to this video. You may also find it useful to stop and pause the video every now and again to think about what has been said.
Hi Jo, I thought it would be useful to sit down and go through your answer together. I know you understand the content of the P5 syllabus, but when it comes to doing an exam question, you seem to struggle to get the marks. In the classroom, when I ask you questions, you know the answers, so I don't think it's a lack of knowledge that's preventing you from passing this exam.
I know. I'm confident that I know the syllabus very well. I just seem to go wrong somewhere in the exam.
Well, let's take a look at this answer and see if we can understand where you've gone wrong. I think, from looking through this, one of the key reasons you have failed this exam is because you answer it as if it's a P3 exam.
What do you mean?
Well, let's take a look at this question. I've marked all of it, but part A in particular shows me where you might be taking the wrong approach. Part A is worth 16 marks, and so you'd need to spend about 28 minutes on it. Do you think you did that?
I know in the past I haven't managed my time very well. So when I did this question, I made sure I timed myself exactly, as I know time management is key to passing this exam.
That's great. Remember, longer answers often don't score well in the exam as they contain irrelevant material and don't answer the question properly. Shorter answers, where a student has spent time thinking about what the examiner wants, usually score better. We'll look at the question requirements in a moment. However, one important feature of P5 is that question scenarios include instructions about what you have to do. Here, the last section of the scenario makes it very clear that your answer has to be focused on performance management and not strategic decision making, as you would in P3. The requirements echo what the scenario says. They ask you to assess the impact of the external business environment on performance management and give a justified recommendation for a new performance measure, using Porter's 5 forces model to structure your answer. So, under each of Porter model headings, you need to provide one performance measure and at least one performance management recommendation. Do you think you did that?
I think so. I certainly wrote about Porter's 5 forces, brought in points about the external environment, and made recommendations about what Stokeness should do.
Okay, let's have a look at your answer then. You've started with an explanation of Porter's 5 forces.
Yes, I have.
That would be a good start if you were answering a P3 question, and you would get some marks for the knowledge. For P5 though, the 5 forces provide a framework for discussing performance measurement and management issues that the examiner is looking for. You won't get much credit for a definition like this, and you'd be better off going straight into discussing the first element. This is really good analysis of barriers to entry from the viewpoint of P3. It explains clearly why new entrants will struggle. But this part of the answer wouldn't score well in P5. The R&D measure you suggest doesn't really tell Stokeness' managers anything they don't know, as they are well aware that a new entrant will have to spend a lot of money on R&D. And you haven't really made any comment about performance management. All you have said is use another measure, operating gearing.
But operating gearing is important, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but you haven't explained why.
I remember being able to say quite a lot about substitutes and use the information in the scenario.
Yes, you do go into quite a lot of detail, but it's probably too much for P5 as you haven't linked your analysis to performance measurement and management. The measure you suggest shows that you didn't pick up the comment in the question scenario that the definition of the market is a problem. Taking over a competitor would be a valid suggestion in a P3 answer, but in P5 it wouldn't get marks as it's a strategic recommendation rather than a performance management recommendation. You've summarised the position on suppliers really well here. However, you've given 3 performance measures when the examiner asked for 1, and you haven't justified any of them. You also haven't said anything about performance management.
Yes, that was careless. I realise I've thrown away some marks there.
This would be very good analysis if you were answering a P3 question, but is again too much for P5.
I know that in the model answer, one of the suggested measures was the number of alternative customers, so I know I'd get some marks for suggesting using that as a measure.
The number of customers is a possible measure, but it isn't clearly linked to the previous paragraph, where you talk about customer size rather than the number of customers. The suggestion about developing good relations with customers would be too vague for both P3 and P5. You need to say what actions Stokeness would take, and for P5, what the consequences would be for performance management. Looking at this last section, it looks like you ran out of time. Is that right?
Yes, I did. I tried to get something down before the time ran out.
The comment on competition is a bit too broad. You've also again given more than one measure and again not justified any of them. As earlier in your answer, you've also suggested using a measure related to the market, though the definition of the market is a problem. The suggestion about conducting research could be a performance management suggestion, but you need to be more specific about the information you required and what you're going to do with it. Let's have a look at the main points in ACCA's model answer. The mark scheme gives up to 4 marks for a justified performance measure and performance management implications for each force. The model answer suggests revenue derived from patented products as a measure. New entrants cannot sell these products themselves as they are protected by patents. So the higher this amount, the more Stokeness is protected from the threat of new entrants.
Isn't the obvious management recommendation then to develop more products?
That would be a strategic decision, which you could suggest in P3. For P5, though, the point is related to performance management systems, that Stokeness should have clear procedures in place for recording and assessing technology developments to see if they can form the basis of patented products. Here, the answer suggests measuring the threat of substitutes by how costly it will be to create a rival product.
Won't there be non-financial barriers to developing substitutes? And wouldn't Stokeness want to try to measure them?
Technology and infrastructure are already in place or are being developed, and so they won't be major problems for Stokeness's competitors. Cost is likely to be the most important measure here, as it's the most significant barrier. Industry developments and changes in fuel prices will mean that cost does not stay the same. Hence, the performance management point is monitoring relevant data to keep the measure up to date, and also involving engineering as well as financial staff to ensure the cost estimate is realistic. The answer recommends using switching costs as a measure by explaining why they're high. This extract refers to the technology, but the answer also talks elsewhere about raw materials being rare, and a few suppliers being able to control them and thus dictate costs. As well as raw material suppliers, Stokeness is also dependent on the engineering subcontractors it uses. Knowing about the design of Stokeness's product gives them the power. This leads to the performance management point that Stokeness needs to protect its intellectual capital by setting up non-disclosure agreements.
Could you discuss the management of relationships with raw material suppliers instead?
Yes, you could do, although it would have to be related to performance management. For example, you could link inventory systems to provide greater certainty that materials will be available when required. It's fine here to use the same measure, switching costs, as for power of suppliers. If its customers have high costs of switching, it will be good news for Stokeness, whereas high costs of changing its suppliers will be bad news.
But the scenario says that vehicle manufacturers are only now setting up deals with engine makers. If customers aren't yet committed to Stokeness, surely there are no switching costs at the moment?
That's right, and the answer points out that this is an issue, that switching costs will only be relevant once a customer is committed. The performance management point leads on from this, that Stokeness should either make an exclusive arrangement with a single customer or develop a product that a number of customers will compete to buy. Entering an exclusive arrangement would be the better choice, as Stokeness needs to develop a close relationship to ensure technologies are compatible. The measure of time to market reflects the fact that products are still being developed for the market. The model answer justifies this by stating that the commonly used measure of market share will only apply when there's a market.
Of course. This links in with what the scenario says about the CEO having doubts about calculating market share.
That's right. Using time to market as a performance measure also ties in with the clear performance management recommendation of delivering the product and generating cash flows as quickly as possible. I think it would be helpful now to ask you to come up with 4 things that you've learned from this discussion.
I think I can do that. First, I need to make sure I understand exactly what the question scenario and requirements want me to do, and I should provide exactly what they ask. Second, it's not worth spending time explaining models such as Porter's 5 forces. I'll show that I know them when I use them for structuring my answers. Third, if I'm recommending performance measures, I must justify why they are helpful by using the information in the scenario. And finally, I must remember that I'm in the P5 exam and not P3. I mustn't take time to analyse the company's situation if the analysis doesn't relate to the recommendations that I'll be making. Also, if I'm asked to make recommendations about performance management, I won't get marks for making suggestions about future strategy if I don't show how those recommendations will lead to improved performance management.
That's very good. I think you've got a lot out of doing this. If you remember those points, I'm sure you'll pass next time.